Well, hi, everybody. I'm Erin Shigaki, and I am here with the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee for our 2021 online virtual pilgrimage. We hope to see you in person next year. Today, I am really happy to be in conversation with Frank Abe and Tamiko Nimura. We Hereby Refuse, Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration, is the story of camp as you've never seen it before. While they complied when evicted from their homes in 1942, many refused to submit to imprisonment in American concentration camps without a fight. Based upon painstaking research, We Hereby Refuse presents an original vision of America's past with disturbing links to the American present. Today, like I said, I'm honored to be joined by Frank Abe and Tamiko Nimura, who are beloved community members and authors. And we're going to take a closer look at the Minidoka part of the story, the draft resistance of Jim and Gene Akutsu, and the organizing of the Mothers Society of Minidoka, and the brief life of the Civil Liberties League. Frank Abe wrote and directed the PBS film on the largest organized resistance to incarceration, Conscience and the Constitution. He won an American Book Award for John Okada, the life and rediscovered work of the author of No Boy, and is co-editing a new anthology of incarceration literature for Penguin Classics. He blogs at resistors.com. Tamiko Nimura is an Asian American Sansei Pinay writer living in Tacoma, Washington. Her training in community journalism, literature, and American ethnic studies, master's PhD from the University of Washington, prepared her to research, document, and tell the stories of people of color. She can be found at tamikonimura.net. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Erin.
Great to be in community with you, even though we're in 3 different spaces. I thought that we would start out with Frank reading the first 3 pages from Jim Akutsu's arrival at Minidoka, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Erin. As you noted, this is just the story of Jim Akutsu. There's 2 others, Mitsuyo Endo and Hiroshi Kashiwagi. And in the story, we've seen Jim's father be arrested by the FBI 2 months after Pearl Harbor. We've seen his father be separated from the family in a tearful scene at King Street Station after the father was interrogated by the FBI in the immigration detention station on Airport Way. In Seattle. And so, and we've seen Jim be taken away on a bus from Seattle to Puyallup Fairgrounds, the Assembly Center, and from there on a train to Minidoka. So this picks up with Jim's arrival at Minidoka, which is the subject of our talk today. Jim says, "I was appalled at my first sight of the desolate camp in Idaho. The first thought that came to my mind was concentration camp. The watchtowers were still being finished. Barbed wire was strung all around. Farm crews kept cutting the wire to get to the field, so the contractor quickly electrified it. The camp director put a stop to that fast, but we remembered the electrified fence for a long time. In Puyallup, Mr. Sakamoto, James Sakamoto, targeted for an honor killing by those who resented his authority. But here, his influence waned, and the plot was soon forgotten. I wrote letter after letter to the Justice Department for release of my father, but nothing worked." And a woman says, "Don't get too friendly with the Akutsus. Your husband might get taken away, too." Jim opens the locker. Stealing was rampant. Footballs and basketballs I ordered for the kids went missing. Officials were selling meat from the mess halls on the black market. I caught a cook serving his family a Thanksgiving turkey he'd taken from the mess. Gene and I banged him up pretty good. Yes, I raised hell. Trouble was, next morning the cooks refused to serve breakfast. The block manager stormed over to our barracks. But it was my mother she came to see. "The cooks fear for their safety. You need to come and apologize." And Jim says, "Don't do it, Mom. He's a thief." The block manager says to the mother, "Look what your two thugs did." She says, "But my son says that man was taking our food." Block manager, "Get on your knees, apologize, or no one in our block eats today." Mrs. Akutsu thinks for a second. Then she gets on her knees and debases herself in front of the others. "I apologize for the actions of my sons. Please forgive them." Jim says, "Boy, that really broke my mother. Mom, you need to eat. We must get your father back. We must write again to the Attorney General." Camp life, which is far different from the life that they enjoyed in their home on First Hill in Seattle. And from there, the story goes on. And I know that, Erin, you were struck by the scene of the mother having to apologize for the actions of her son. This is a story that Jim told in an oral history interview, I think with Venture, actually. And, Jim says he raised hell, and that was a characteristic of Jim's. I mean, he was a feisty guy. I mean, unlike the character of Ichiro and Nono Boy, when taunted or spat upon, Jim would fight back. He would not take that stuff from anyone. So I'm glad we had a chance to kind of reframe that story a little bit for Jim.
Yeah, and I like that the graphic novel really does a deep exploration of Mrs. Akutsu as well. And I think that this is a remarkably humbling and shameful scene, right? And I'm sure that Jim didn't expect that his mom was going to have to pay this weird price for his crime. But I wanted to also point out that through the whole graphic novel, we see this incredible emotional range of Mrs. Akutsu, from talking back to the FBI agents when they come and take her husband, to, shouting out for him at King Street Station, and then we'll talk about some of her other activism. But I love that this Issei woman is really broadly drawn.
And the thing is, Erin, that she really is a proxy for the experience of everyone in camp. The point of the book is to show, start to finish, that we had a community that was in Seattle, that was settled, it was prosperous, it was growing, and then interrupted. And then taken to camp, things happen in camp, terrible things happen in camp. And then they come out and you see the changes. So from start to finish, you see, Mrs. Akutsu as a homemaker knitting Afghan squares for the Red Cross, and by the end, no spoiler alert, but she comes to a tragic end. And again, this is a proxy for the experience of Japanese America in camp, and I think that's what maybe a lot of people are responding to in this story.
Yeah, exactly. And I liked how, you all sort of drew out Jim's initial activism too, this sort of community care that he imparts in making sure the elders, get to go out from the rain, and that there's like a meal delivery service set up. Because I think those things are important to point out too, like where the community held together and then where it started to fall apart in these crazy conditions.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually a little backdoor way of getting a little jab at JACL's management of the conditions in Puyallup. I mean, Jim was upset with Jimmy Sakamoto in camp, and as the story hints at, there was an assassination plot against the Seattle chapter JACL president at Puyallup for the way he was running things. And fortunately, Shosuke Sasaki told them to wait till they got to Minidoka, and at Minidoka, conditions changed, and the honor killing was no longer necessary. But that was a way to bring in, that tension, and it had, as you say, this other dimension of revealing the caring of Jim. I mean, Jim after the war became I think a scout leader and a basketball coach. A lot of readers pick up on the fact, oh yeah, Jim Akutsu was my basketball coach when I was a kid. So he did have that community spirit.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the brief life of the Civil Liberties League out of Portland, which was backing Minyasui, and then kind of go into the infamous loyalty questionnaire that split apart so many families and
Sure. And we talk about this book as the story of camp as you've never seen it before. And, this is one of those stories that is out there, but, we never really talk about it at Minidoka Pilgrimages. Minyasui had a strong defense committee in Minidoka in November of 42, or November, December. Correction. He had a strong defense committee closer to January 43. And these are primarily his friends in the Portland area, guys like Dr. George Tanai, guys like filmmaker Corey Shiozaki's father, Ron Shiozaki. And they raised money for Minyasui's Supreme Court. Well, his challenge to the racial-based curfew that eventually went to the Supreme Court. So the Minyasui Defense Committee, changing its name to the Civil Liberties League, went around barrack to barrack raising $4 a piece from families. And this alarmed the leaders of the Japanese American Citizens League. And Mike Masaoka, in fact, came to Minidoka in January 23rd, 1943, to claim that the Civil Liberties League was a stab in the back at the efforts of JACL to work with the government, and that most of the Seattle chapter of JACL leaders were opposed to the Yasui committee right along, contending that to help Yasui would be un-American. Mike, and as this panel shows, I mean, and Mike's dialogue is really drawn from the record. I'm looking at a naval intelligence report that talks about this specific meeting. Mike argued it was the duty of the Nisei to cooperate with the government, not to fight it. And James Sakamoto at this meeting said, folks, you got to remember that Minyasui was a reserve officer in the U.S. Army, while at the same time being admittedly a paid agent for Japan. This is war, and to aid Yasui is to aid a Japanese agent. Such an act is not American. Well, we know better now that Min was not a Japanese agent, but I mean, this was the thinking at the time. And this one panel, I'm glad we were able to get this in, but it shows that, contrary to the hindsight we have now, not everyone was behind these Supreme Court test cases.
Well, let's talk about the famous or infamous loyalty questionnaire, which is, I think, a really important piece of this story that that is a little hard to understand, maybe.
Well, and I'm glad you raised that up, Erin, because in the Kashiwagi part of the story that we're not showing today, what you're looking at right now is the Akutsu's reaction to the questionnaire. But in other parts of the story, this book shows you how the loyalty questionnaire really was a mistake, not a mistake, but just a mishandling of a need from two different agencies. The War Department needed to clear the Nisei for service in the military, and the WRA needed some means to clear incarcerees for release from camp for jobs in the Eastern Midwest. Having branded our parents and grandparents as disloyal spies and saboteurs, and by putting them in camp, they then had to reverse themselves, change direction, and now find a way to reassure the American public that they weren't letting spies and saboteurs into the U.S. Army or into your kid's college in Oberlin in Ohio. So they devised this questionnaire that was meant to serve the needs of both agencies, combined into one for ease of administration. And that's the scene that we'll show with McCloy and Dylan Meyer. So
just to add really quickly, Frank, I wanted to just add that the questionnaire was administered unevenly among the different camps, not in terms of numbers, right? But less time at some camps, right? I believe you
Tule Lake was terrible.
Right,
yeah.
Tule Lake was terrible, right?
Botched.
That they had no translators for the questionnaires, and so the Issei were very confused. So just to contrast that to the rest of the story, and we show that the uneven administration of the questionnaire in the book as well. Thanks.
Yeah. So what this panel shows the Akutsu's, or Jim Akutsu's response to the questionnaire. Jim's answer was yes, no. He tried to volunteer for the Army 2 or 3 times, tried to enlist before Pearl Harbor and after, but was rejected for flat feet. So his answer was, yes, I'm willing to go wherever they send me. 28, however, he had an interesting take on that, and that he felt it was the American answer was to answer no, because if you answer yes, it's like signing a confession that you were once disloyal. They're asking us to incriminate ourselves. The only answer for a good American is to say no. Emotionally, Jim was very upset that they took away his 1A classification in January of 42 and classified the Nisei got new draft cards shortly after Pearl Harbor, reclassifying them as 4C, which is the classification for enemy alien. And that's the point at which a lot of the Nisei were saying, they've taken away my citizenship. Because they had this draft card, this piece of paper, official government document that said it implied you are no longer a citizen, you are an enemy alien. It didn't legally do that, of course, but that's what they felt. And in the absence of good information from the government, that was what the people felt. And so Jim felt that the Constitution, Bill of Rights, none of that protected him anymore. And this led to his eventual decision to refuse induction a year later, after the questionnaire, when he was got a letter from the Selective Service.
And anything other than yes, right, got sort of immediately classified as no. You couldn't say I refuse to answer, as Hiroshi Kashiwagi did. You couldn't say anything other than yes, and not be classified as no. And disloyal.
Yeah, I mean, Tamiko's uncle Hiroshi refused at first to answer the questionnaire, and then was threatened with jail time, a prison time, and a hefty fine because he was told he was breaking the law, and only
$20,000, right?
10,000. I forget the 5 years, 10 years, and a $5,000 fine.
Right.
But the numbers vary. It was only, after the war, 30 years, 40 years after the war, that he was realizing, reading books, that this was not true. It was not illegal. There was no statute making it a crime to refuse to answer the leave clearance questionnaire. And this was just a misunderstanding or a mistake by the camp directors at the different camps, because they did not know exactly the consequences of a yes or no answer. So, the whole, it's just another example, Erin, of how the whole camp experience was made up as they went along. And the book, I think the book captures that feeling. America had never, had concentration camps before for its own citizens. And so, they were making the stuff up as they went along. And a lot of mistakes were made, and this was one of them.
Yeah, I really appreciate how you all show those backroom conversations, with the higher ups and the U.S. military and leadership, and the JACL folks trying to broker the individual deals that they were trying to make. I just think it paints a really full picture, of this mess, right?
Yeah. I'm glad that worked for you because, if you're going to tell the story of resistance, you have to show what they're resisting against. And again, this is not about pointing fingers at, for example, JACL. The wartime JACL, or the JACL of today is not the same organization. It's a different organization than it was in 1942. So I think that needs to be said too.
For sure. It's quite radical today. Frank, I wonder if you could talk about Mr. Akutsu and how and when he's reunited with his family in Minidoka, and how that came about.
Well, earlier in the book, you'll see when you read it that there is a tearful farewell at King Street Station where 100 Issei men, including the fathers of Jim Akutsu and John Okada, were taken out of the immigration detention station on Airport Way and put on a train for the Department of Justice alien internment camp at Fort Missoula, Montana. And from there, Mr. Akutsu was moved around the country to Bismarck, North Dakota, to Louisiana, to, I think, New Mexico. As you saw earlier, Jim and his mother were busy writing letters to everyone they could think of. The U.S. Attorney for Western Washington, the Attorney General. Here we see Mr. Akutsu in his one of his stops with the enemy alien target on his back. And this is a jacket that was Satsuki Ina's father had a jacket like this, and she donated it to, I think, the Smithsonian. And we saw this photograph of it and knew that it had to be part of our story. Don't try to run. That enemy alien on your back makes an easy target. Jim's actually asked if they could leave Minidoka and join their father in, Bismarck, North Dakota, for example, just as a way for their mother to be reunited with their father. But even that was denied. Finally, Mrs. Akutsu wrote this letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, a painfully emotional plea, asking to have her husband sent back, and attesting to the Americanism, loyalty of her sons. And this letter was translated by the State Department, and I found it in Mr. Akutsu's enemy alien file. And it may have worked because a few weeks later, the order came down that Mr. Akutsu should be sent back to Minidoka. And so if you go to the next slide, the family got a telegram telling that the family to send someone to meet Mr. Akutsu at the front gate of Minidoka at noon on the noon bus. I assume there was a regular run. And it was in November of 43, which means that Mr. Akutsu had been gone for nearly 2 years. And they had not seen each other. We imagined that it was snowing at this time. And Jim in his interviews didn't tell us the weather. But Jim does say that an old man asked him for directions to the Akutsu barrack. And Jim said, "Oh, it's back over there, block 5. And I said, "Fine, thank you," and went on. And then Jim, as you see here, trudges through the snow, and Ross Ishikawa drew this wonderful landscape of the front gate at Minidoka with the tower, which is very evocative and drawn to the photographs that we gave him. And Jim waited for the bus, didn't show up, went back to the barrack and said, Dad didn't show. And his father was there and says, "Hajime, how are you?" And Dad, I didn't recognize you. You've changed so much. And that's the truth. The father and son had changed so much that neither recognized the other.
It's heartbreaking. And that happened time after time, I know.
Yeah, that was a scene dramatized in Farewell to Manzanar and Jeannie Houston's novel and film, where Cole Wakatsuki comes back and Noble McCarthy's all in tears at seeing him. But it's a familiar story. It's unfortunately a very familiar story.
Well, I want to turn back to Mrs. Akutsu and the Issei women in camp. And Tamiko, I was wondering if you could talk about who Fuyu Tanagi is and who were the Mother Society of Minidoka and what did they do? What sorts of actions did they carry out?
Fuyu Tanagi was a very well-educated woman. She was educated in Japan as a teacher, had a lot of language skills, would translate things for other Japanese families in Seattle. They owned the area, which is now Taitung, as a grocery store. And so she was a member of the Mother Society of Minidoka, which formed, we believe, in English language classes that the Issei women would take. Now, Mrs. Tanagi would have had a lot of these skills, but probably would have joined to meet other mothers and work with other Issei mothers. So Miura Shimabukuro, who is a scholar and poet from Seattle also, has this book, Relocating Authority, from which we drew a lot of the work for these panels. Miura also presented her work at the pilgrimage, I believe, not too long ago. And so the Mother Society was very upset, of course, at their son's changed citizenship status, and they decided to draft a petition. They brought it to Minyasui, who was at Minidoka. And so I think the next slide would then have a picture of them bringing a possible letter to him. And what's so fascinating is that they decided his letter was not the right tone that they wanted to strike. Miura's book, which is wonderful, has the original draft that they did that Minisui changed for them, and then what they did to the letter after that. And so we show some debates among the mothers in this book, which we kind of dramatized about, what does this mean? Why should we do this? Why have our sons go die for nothing? And then they basically circulated a petition. 100 Issei mothers signed the petition to President Roosevelt. And at the end of the letter, they had a little paragraph to Mrs. Roosevelt as well. They got a response from the White House, but it was from Eleanor Roosevelt. And it seemed kind of form letter-like, and they were really disappointed because she didn't even sign the letter. But we put this in part to stand in for the other mothers' societies, and we talk about this a bit in the book. There were mother societies at Poston and at Topaz, so they were not the only ones, but they were for Issei mothers, perhaps with limited language skills, quite organized and openly quite defiant about their son's status.
Yeah, and that Nina Wallace also recently wrote a very interesting post about these mothers on the Densho blog.
Mm-hmm.
And I pulled out a little quote from that. It was a powerful display of Issei women's ability to organize, make their voices heard, and write their own narrative as leaders within their communities who would not accept abuse without complaint. And I think, again, another great thing about this novel, I myself kind of get stuck in this idea of noble silence of our people or just the complication of silence. Well, we weren't all silent. It wasn't true at all. And I am just really grateful that you're bringing these stories out to the contrary of that notion.
A couple of things are at play there, Erin, that, there's an undercurrent that's not mentioned in the letters that, JCL did advocate for the banning of Japanese in camp. So these silences were not accidental. They were somewhat enforced by both JCL and WRA. The Issei were denied votes in many community council meetings. this and the draft itself, what the Fuyu Tanagi here is protesting, is of course the policy of Mike Masaoka and JCL. So what you're looking at here is women taking agency over their own families, and protesting not just the government but the JCL and the silent, not the silent, but the banning of Japanese, the marginalization of the Issei camp. So it's these are the factors they're pushing against. I want to add, Erin, that again, not wanting to point fingers at JCL, the bigger picture here is putting this back on Congress and the government, because what divides the interests of the Issei and the Nisei is citizenship. And under the 14th Amendment, the Nisei are entitled to birthright citizenship. Congress, on the other hand, after the 14th Amendment was adopted, then pulled back naturalized citizenship from people of Asiatic descent. Part of this was the result of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and part of it was it was mostly that. So the Nisei were denied the chance to become citizens, and so this sets up a tension between the generations in camp where they have different interests. The Issei have no voice, whereas the Nisei, because they feel privileged to be citizens, feel the need to exercise that through military service, or to protest it through these constitutional challenges.
Here we have a facsimile, but a pretty faithful facsimile of the letter that the mother sent, and then a facsimile again of that petition, which I believe Mira got from her from Fuyu Tanagi's daughter. And so Ross, the artist who drew these panels, really took great care to make sure that it looked pretty authentic, that the font was right, and that the petition had the right names as far as we could tell.
Well, let's talk about what eventually happens to Gene and Jim Akutsu. Gene, having just graduated from the camp high school, refuses the draft and is sent to prison in Boise, and then Jim soon to follow. Do you want to fill us in on those stories, Frank, please?
Well, yeah, Gene just felt that the family had been kicked around enough so that when he got his draft notice, and he was among the first, he says, to get an induction notice at Minidoka, he simply refused to show up for the induction, which was, I believe, held outside of camp. So he was arrested, and when the U.S. Marshals came to his door, Marilyn and Jeff told me a story at one of our meetings of how the U.S. Marshals said, "Still time for you to, if you want to change your mind and report for the draft, we'll forget about it." And Gene said, "No, you give me back my citizenship, and then I'll forget about it." And so they stuck him in the squad car between two big, Hakujin marshals for the ride from Minidoka, from Hunt to Boise, Idaho. Evidently a long drive. And then Jim a letter was slipped under his door a little while after that. And this was Jim Akutsu's big complaint. And I hope I get the story right, but his draft notice is dated. He received it like in July, and is dated for him to report in like May. And he says, "Well, this date's already passed. This is a setup." And to the end of his days, Jim would wave this letter in front of anyone who would listen and say, "Look at this! They tried to. This whole thing was a phony setup, and they did it because I was a troublemaker in camp, and they wanted to get rid of me." And there's some evidence of that possibly being true. nevertheless, so Jim and Gene both wind up in jail cells in Boise, Idaho, where they are set for trial before in U.S. District Court in Boise, Idaho, and Mia and Hanako and Kurt and I had a memorable field trip to look for the federal courthouse. And we actually, Hanako pulled some strings and got us into the actual federal courthouse where these trials took place. And the drawing you see here is a replica from a photograph I took there in that room. The judge in the case was Chase Clark, formerly the governor of Idaho, defeated and then was appointed to the bench. I think Eric Muller points out the conflict of interest that Chase Clark had in presiding. He should have recused himself from the trial of the Minidoka draft resistors because, as I think Eric points out, it was Governor Clark's own actions that prevented the Western Defense Command from allowing Japanese Americans from Seattle to voluntarily relocate, if you will, to areas like Idaho. Chase Clark, here's the quote: "Japs live like rats, breathe like rats, and act like rats. I won't take any of them in Idaho except under guard and confined in concentration camps." So with that, Clark should have recused himself, did not. And Eric, this whole sequence here of the trial is drawn from Eric's excellent legal research into the nature of the kangaroo court nature of the trial of the Minidoka draft resistors, which was that Clark, ruled out any constitutional issues to be considered by the jury, like Judge Blake Kennedy in Wyoming, allowed the jury only to consider the facts of the Selective Service Act, like a speeding ticket. Did you do it? Did you refuse to report for induction? Did you drive over the speed limit? Yes, then you're guilty. And it's open and shut. It's a binary decision. No argument about the morality of it. Morality doesn't play an issue part in this decision. And Eric noticed that the jury lists were all remarkably similar, meaning that the same set of like 36 people, the fine men and women of Boise, Idaho, the same set of them were cycled through these 33 trials, so that by the end of 2 or 3 days of these trials, these jurors had heard the same arguments, the same pleas over and over again. And by the time they get to the last cases, they're just, as we show in the novel, going out, smoke a cigarette, come back in, guilty. It was an assembly line justice, I think, as Eric puts it. And that was exactly what Minya Sui had predicted for him when Jim met with Min earlier in our story, that it'll be a kangaroo court. Min went on to threaten, not to intimidate Jim by saying he'll be beaten with a 2x4 in prison, but that's a different story.
But he didn't, and neither of the Akutsu brothers end up getting beaten in prison, right? But they did serve time at McNeil Island, and
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and we show a little bit. Jim's great quote in one of his interviews was, "When I heard, we were sent to prison, 3 years, 3 months, then the ferry ride from Steilacoom to McNeil, they would look north and think about Seattle, 50 miles in the distance, and realize how close they were to home, and yet so far, right?" When they were processed and put in their cells, the clank of the jail cell doors, he says, "I got that cold feeling," and that was the perfect way to end that scene. I got that cold feeling of being in prison.
Well, Tamiko, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what brought you to this project, because I know in part it's that you are telling your uncle's story, and I wondered how that was for you.
There are so many feelings I have about being able to tell my uncle's story. And he passed in 2019, so before he could see the final product. And we wish that he were still with us. What I realized while working on his story for this book, I had edited his first 2 books, so I knew his story pretty well. What I realized while working on this one, though, was that parts of his camp story were still very much with him into his 90s. Right, he was in his mid 90s when he passed away. That there are parts that still really infuriated him. You could just sort of feel the heat when he was reading Michi Wegland's book, Years of Infamy, and realizing these were empty threats. I didn't have to comply with these. He was a lovely person, had this very wry sense of humor, sensitive though, and poetic. And there were parts of the community that I think he still felt ostracized by and shunned by, even as parts of the community came to celebrate him eventually. So I wanted to make sure that that longer lasting part of the effects of camp was something that we could include in the book, even briefly. Frank knew him too, right? And we're friends as well. But I think for me, it was a really special opportunity to work with his story, particularly for this format.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up the piece about the long-lasting effects of camp, because I think that's another, poignant scene that Mrs. Akutsu stands in for, right? Where she's back in Seattle, they've made it out, and she's trying to find comfort in her old church community and is shunned. There's just, I think people are going through so much trauma that there's a lot of bad behavior. I don't know how else to describe it.
The way to describe it, Erin, is the government divided us, and that our community embraced those divisions.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it was very painful for him still, right? And he wrote a lot about the divisions and the loyalty oath. We adapt scenes from his work in the book. The Betrayed is a play that he wrote about the loyalty oath specifically. There are pieces of that. There are pieces where he had to slaughter his family chickens on the farm before they left for camp. So there's a lot that he left us, right, as far as records, records, writings, and of course conversations and interviews that he had with a lot of different places. But I still think that, yeah, there are places in the community where he felt like nobody had really forgiven him. Not that there was something necessarily to forgive, but people had not necessarily come to accept the reasons for his decisions.
Tamiko, the JCL apologized to the Tulians in August of 2019.
Right.
Did he ever mention to you what his thoughts were on that?
So publicly, right, through my cousin Soji, his middle son, publicly, I think he was actually very gracious about that. Like, glad that happened. That's something that should have been coming. But I also remember very well in Seattle in 2016, I think that was the year when the convention for the JCL was here, and there was a No Boy panel with Morgan Yamanaka and, oh goodness, another No Boy. And someone asked him, how do you feel about this potential apology? And I remember he kind of shocked the room and kind of said, I could give a shit. I couldn't give a shit. So, and I think both of those feelings were true for him, that, whatever happened, right, I stand by my decisions, but also I'm glad that this is where the discussions have landed.
Yeah, that was Frank Emmy's same reaction in 2002 when JCL apologized to the Heart Mountain draft resistors exclusively because they answered yes, yes and then resisted the draft. They couldn't go that extra step to apologize or acknowledge the no-nos until 2019.
Right. And
So yeah, Frank had the same reaction. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
props to Stan Shikuma and the Seattle JCL chapter really for that Thule apology, which I know got amended in discussions and things like that. But props for making that part of the discussion move forward.
You are both very prolific writers of history and culture and fiction and poetry. In the case of you, Tamiko, I was wondering how you both liked writing in this very compressed format of the graphic novel. Did you find it particularly challenging, or was there some kind of a freedom to it?
It took about a year to really understand the structure of graphic novels. And we were aided in this by reading some books. Scott McCloud's book, Understanding Comics, formalized the study of comics. And from there, I learned the vocabulary of graphic novels as juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence, where the emotion often happens in the white space between panels. Also have a friend in New York City, Greg Pak, who writes for DC Comics and Marvel, and had a template for the scripting of a graphic novel in his book called Make Comics Like the Prose. So it was a challenge, but yet the opportunity, Erin, is the visual format, which the Wing Luke grasped as an ideal way for them to fulfill their mission, which is to connect audiences to Asian American stories through vivid storytelling, in their words. So they proposed a series of 3 graphic novels, of which this is the second, to the National Park Service, got a grant, and then put out a call for proposals, and 4 of us responded to that. But the opportunity here is to take stories. If you look over my shoulder here, this way, all these books on the shelf here. I mean, I've collected these books for 45 years, right? Starting from Years of Infamy, Mitchie Wegland, The Spoilage, Dorothy Swain Thomas, and a lot. I mean, the Tule Lake stories, especially the Stockade, the Tule Lake disturbance, the Manzanar riot, are all in these books, and yet they sit on the shelf. And so the opportunity with the graphic novel is to dramatize them and bring them out for the reader visually as almost like a movie, but with the benefit of without the cost of producing a movie, several $1 million. This is a low-cost way of getting the stories out in a storybook form to entertain and, of course, to inform and expose and elucidate our experience. So, and not just our experience, but to have our experience illuminate events as they are unfolding today.
Yeah, we did have a lot to learn. We did a lot of reading. My kids are graphic novel fans, and I had read and taught graphic novels myself, so I wasn't unfamiliar with it. But it's one thing to read them, right? It's another thing to actually try to have to write them. And also, we had a relatively large creative team to work with that. But I loved the graphic novel. I love the graphic novel format because it brings a particular intimacy and immediacy, and it crosses over a lot of different audiences. Right, we have this, younger audience, right, that will find these, educational kinds of, material in a really appealing format that they already know very well. But we also have folks and have heard from folks who are sensei and say, this is stuff that I did not know. And they're often able to read the book in a day or two. And we pack a lot of information in there. So that crossover potential, across the range of ages, audiences, has been really important and exciting.
And did you write the words before the pictures were drawn, or what was the process and also with working with 2 different illustrators?
There was literally a white page, Erin, and I think the artists were a little impatient because they were hired and they said, where's the script? Don't bother talking to me about vision and structure and theory. Just give me something to draw. And so, because we were all brought together, we didn't come into this with a shared vision, So it was an iterative process of creating outlines which we shared with them. And I was a little bit surprised to see them like jumping on these outlines and then sketching out storyboards, and then having committed those storyboards to paper, they had invested time in that. So, kind of had to write around the storyboards they created. And so out of that, it kind of built up so there was no, there was no chicken or egg. They came together well. Of course, the outline came first, but yeah, the words always come first. But then when you have the drawings, you have to. One of the reasons why the book works so well is that the words are carefully matched to the drawings, and so there's no overlap. I mean, you don't see it, and it has something. The text doesn't tell you what you're already seeing. The text tells you something that's behind the drawings or around the drawings, and so it was just again an iterative process.
Yeah, but there were hundreds of reference photos that had to be gathered to be used for the artists. What did the model trucks look like at this time? Were the guard towers straight or at an angle at this time at Thule? Because there were two different kinds of guard towers that got built at Thule. Would a barrack at Topaz have had a little shelf on the window? Just down to that kind of level of detail, which is really in giving a lot of credit to Frank's attention to detail and meticulous attention to that level of research.
Yeah,
so, you're an artist. You probably have a better eye for these things, but I go to the Minidoka Pilgrimage and look around and take things for granted a little bit. But then when it comes time to writing these darn graphic novels, you don't really think about what do the steps at Minidoka look like, and then how are they different, realizing they're different from the steps to the barracks at Topaz, because Topaz is built on different silt, and so the steps are flatter there. And Tamiko mentioned the legs on the guard towers at Thule. Barbara Takei pointed that out to us very early. It's attention to detail. But as you as an artist would pick up on those things right away.
Yeah, it's true. And then since I've spent most of my time on the Minidoka site of all of them, I noticed that the slant of the fence was correct, and this sort of thing.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I mean, that had to be worked on with the artist. That there's a 5-foot barbed wire fence and a 1-foot overhang, and that I knew that had to be right, because I knew people like you would call us on it. So I mean, this book is for people like you, Erin.
Well, thank you. I'm going to end with just asking you each what you're working on. It sounds like there's a memoir going on with you, Tamiko, and an anthology for you. Frank, could you tell us a little bit about these projects?
Go ahead, Tamiko.
So I have several projects in the works. I usually tend to, but one of them is a memoir called Pilgrimage. And it's a book that's going to talk about the importance of community and healing, as I learned it at a very memorable Thule Lake pilgrimage. And it'll incorporate sections from my dad's unpublished memoir of his time at Thule. He was 10 to about 13 or 14 when he was there. Another project that I have that I'm wrapping up with the artist Naomi Shintani in the Bay Area is exhibit text at the Tanforan BART station, or the San Bruno BART station. There will be a large new exhibit at the station there, covering as much as we can about Tanforan and camp history in about 2,000 words and 14 panels, artwork and so on. I'm working with professors at the University of Washington, Tacoma on a project bringing Tacoma's Japanese American history to the campus itself and memorializing it there, and also providing some resources for descendants of Japanese Americans from Tacoma, because they spread out quite a bit. And I worked with the Washington State History Museum on some curriculum that they are developing in conjunction with their new exhibit, which opens this month on the legacy of Executive Order 9066.
Fantastic. Wow, that's quite a list. What about you, Frank?
Well, you mentioned I've got to finish up this new anthology of camp literature with my John Okada co-editor, Floyd Chung. And it will be, as you might suspect, like the graphic novel, an anthology of camp literature like you've never seen it before. It will have that kind of a feel to it. But beyond that, I think I probably want to return to my roots in the theater. And I was pleased that the writing of the narration and dialogue came so naturally once we laid the foundation of a workable story and mapped out the scenario. So that's a process I want to continue in developing a work of some kind for the stage or the screen.
Very exciting.
We shall see.
Really looking forward to seeing all of these things come out. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today in this conversation. We appreciate your time so much, Tamiko and Frank, and look forward to seeing everybody hopefully on the site in 2022.
Great. That'd be great.
Thanks for having us.
Everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Erin.
you.